Chapter 3. Most of the fatal casualties of the tragedy had been among the principals of the company of the Great Lafayette. In fact, of the regular touring performers, only an attractive blonde lady and a tall, swarthy man remained. There were, of course, others involved who sat with them. The theater manager, for instance, and the musical director, and another who was a journalist working for Edinburgh Informer. A daily newspaper. Holmes introduced himself to each of them passing along the space which conveniently existed for that block of stalls in which they sat. Then he started his interrogations with the blonde lady who rejoiced in the stage name of Louise Latour. She admitted that it was a nom de theatre, telling us that she was actually Lily Davis, but Louise Latour has a contentional ring to it, don't you think, dearie? She spoke with an East London accent, which seemed to lay a little short of her having been born within the sound of bow bells. Holmes got the place of her birth with extreme accuracy. You originate from Greenwich, Miss Latour. She was surprised at his words. Blimey. I came from Kent, really, but I was born and raised in Greenwich until I was about 8 years old. Then we decided to stay in Edinburgh, where we went each summer hopping. Holmes nodded gravely. That would account for the slight modification of your basic South London accent. Those born in Greenwich have a version of this style of speech which has been affected to some extent by the seafarers who mix with the local populace. But I admit that I missed out on the Kentish softening. You worked as a performer with the Lafayette Company, did you not? She nodded, a rather harsh expression, made mask-like with cosmetics being softened at once when she smiled. I remember thinking without that facial adornment, she would have looked so much better. But she was in any case quite a handsome woman, and I could well see that given the lights and distance presented in the theatre, she could have seemed to an audience quite beautiful. She said principal assistant, which means that I was produced from nowhere and disappeared at the wave of his hand, dear. Holmes asked, You were involved with the lion illusion? Her manner hardened. No, no, love. It was Pauline who played the princess, and she's dead. Listen, I'll tell you anything I know that may help you find whatever it is that you want to know, except where it has to do with his secrets. I signed a contract to that effect, and he always paid me well and treated me fair. I'm not going to peach on him now that he is dead and gone. With that, she folded her arms in a slightly defensive gesture. Holmes smiled at her, not unkindly. My dear lady, I will not of course press you upon this point, although the mechanical details of the apparatus and its use in performance might be valuable. But in any case, I have no official position in this affair, so instead let me ask you a little concerning Sigmund Neuberger himself. In questioning others, I have gained an impression of great eccentricity. Would you care to comment upon this? Her defensive manner relaxed, and she laughed. He had his funny little ways, but he certainly wasn't potty, Far from it. I managed to squeeze in a question myself. How about his fixation? The one with his dog. What did you make of that? She lowered her voice as she leant forward, the low neckline of her dress proving somewhat revealing. With her face only inches from mine, she said, it was a bit of an old cardiology, mate. I was about to ask her what cardiology was, but Holmes anticipated my question by saying, ah, yes. He was a showman, we take your point. She turned to him and said, the dog was a good bit of showmanship, that's right. Oh, he was fond of the creature, but then who wouldn't have been? She was a sweet little bitch. But all this business about his life being over when she died was just a, how can I say it, continuation of the newspaper stories that he got from her hotel suites and her picture being on his checks and that. It was Gracia who butted in at this point, asking, but Miss Latour, how about his other peculiarities, such as his male assistants salute him in the street? Why, I actually witnessed this myself a couple of times. She laughed. Yes, but you didn't see him give him an Oxford arf hour later and saying, thanks, boys, have a drink with me. Gracia was puzzled. In Oxford? She grinned. Oxford scholar, $5, Bob. As we moved along the row, Holmes chuckled as he said, my dear Gracia, East London argot is something which, as a solicitor, you would do well to study. He was puzzled. I have heard of rhyming slang, of course, but why did she not say scholar rather than Oxford? Holmes replied that would have made it too easy to follow. For instance, if I asked you to fetch my tit for tat, would you at once guess that I referred to my headgear? However, if I called it a tifter, we would be boarding on a special language from which strangers might be excluded. It's really a simpler version of back slang as practiced by East London butchers. In this particular street, slang, the spelling of words is reversed. For instance, silly women become Yellis Nama. I always let you see my monograph on the street languages of the back streets. The tall, swarthy man who named proved to be Chester Schultz had the speech of a North American, and I tried to play Holmes at his own game, playfully perhaps expecting to expose some of his dialectic skills to be based on luck and to expose and chance. I asked Schultz, from Chicago, are you not? He shook his head, and Holmes said, really, Watson, that observation has no foundation whatsoever. The Windy City produces a speech which splits the words into short, sharp fragments. As example, she cock go, whereas Miss Schultz has extended words of the Midwest, probably Missouri. Y'all is close, but I come from just across Arkansas border. We discovered the Schultz had been brought from America to Newburgh, where he had acted as the illusionist's assistant and the vaudeville circuits. I was with him right from the start, before he was the great Lafayette, when he just had his protein act. Then, when he started to build a big show with the illusions and all, He made me his number one in charge of the other guys. When we questioned him regarding the lion's cage and its manner of use, he was no more forthcoming than Miss Latour had been. In fact, he said, I look upon my giving him my word to keep his secrets as a sort of sacred oath. But anything else I can tell you that might help you, I'll be glad to. He confirmed the opinion that we had already received, that Newberger eccentricity was of the theatrical kind. Holmes said, there was evidently method in his madness, eh, Watson? As we moved along to question the one man among the group from whom we received useful, not to say valuable information, Edward McGrath, of the Edinburgh Informer, was a small hawk-like in appearance, his clothing untidy but of high quality, with dark wrung eyes and unshaven chin, suggesting a sleepless night. Holmes took obvious deduction a stage further, saying, Mr. McGrath, I see that you have not visited your office, nor strayed very far from the spot since the tragedy occurred. The fact that you have a folded issue of the journal with which you are concerned tucked into your pocket of your greatcoat, dated for the very night of the fire, tells me this. Even had you been into the street, you could not have resisted obtaining a more recent issue. You have been in contention with Newberger, which I deduce from the admission ticket lodged in the band on your hat. Usually, your press documents would admit you to the performance. Doubtless you are a critic as well as a reporter. Or what other than an adverse criticism might have made you unpopular with the great Lafayette? You have said is true, sir. My only contact with my editor has been by telephone from the manager's office, and in the recent past, when I worked for a different journal in another city, I did indeed rub Newberger up the wrong way by writing about his performance, and by suggesting that he was able to cause his lion to roar on cue. It was so defensive that I felt I must have stumbled upon something which he would rather not have known. Also, he knew that I clearly wanted to find out something of his methods. He was so ordinary. He was no ordinary illusionist, you know? Where usually some people come to such magical greatness through conjuring the sleight of hand. Newberger had such a background, having been a quick change artist and a sharpshooter. Is it possible that he discovered some element as yet undreamed of by the stage magicians? Holmes was intrigued, but obviously he needed to progress with his investigation. He said, let us return to the events of that tragic night, Mr. McGrath. The newsman nodded and said, during the second half of the show, I felt that I needed to leave my seat, and sneaked in at the stage door, little dreaming that I would have no chance of leaving by the same means, for as you know, the stage door became as impossible to negotiate as most others within 10 minutes of the fire starting. There was a banner hanging in the nearest wing. It read, the great Lafayette would appreciate if those performers, not actually waiting to make an entrance, would stay off the stage during his performance. Positively no visitors allowed. I used the banner, ironically, to hide behind. I wanted to watch the Lion's Bride from this vantage point rather than from the walls. But no sooner had it got underway that there was a blinding flash from the lion's cage, and the poor creature was enveloped in flames and smoke. Newberger was just making his entrance in his robe and carrying his sword. It was almost at once engulfed. I tell you, Mr. Holmes, as a newspaper man, I have seen many fires, but never one started so suddenly or blazed up so quickly. Holmes asked. From the lion's cage, you say, and not from the hanging lantern that has been suggested? He said, definitely from the cage. Within a few seconds I could scarcely see what my hand in front of my face from the smoke. I crouched where I was until the heat made me move. I tried to get out of the way that I had come, but there were burning spars of wood barring my way. In desperation, I turned to try to make my way through the door into the auditorium, but here I came to the most strange and alarming part of my story. The flame suddenly flared, and alarming part of my story, illuminating the fact that my way was barred by the lion. We gasped at this statement. I asked, it had escaped then? He replied, evidently, and as far as I could make out, the poor unfortunate creature was actually on fire, or at least its mane was. It reared up on its hind legs and waved its front paws at me, and I fancied that eerie flashes of light emanating from its claws. I was terrified both of the fire and the escaped lion. But I think the creature was my salvation, because I retreated the only way I could, towards the safety curtains. As I did, I dreaded that I would be roasted, until I discovered that there was a gap where the curtain had not completely descended. Having jammed against some obstructions, I managed to crawl beneath it and into the orchestra pit. Once in the comparative safety of the stalls, I saw the flames starting to lick their way through the gap, through which I had escaped only just in time. Grisha was the first to speak as McGrath appeared to have finished his narration. He asked, whoever would have answered him, is it possible that the lion was trying to signal that the pass door was blocked? Holmes chuckled grimly. I think not. For however intelligent a specimen he might have been, such communication is beyond the scope of Pantherilio, Grisha said, but it was clever enough to return to its cage. Even I allowed myself a smug, grim chuckle at this point. And said, now you have hit upon a real mystery. How did the lion manage to get back into that molten, twisted wreckage of its cage? But I must not indulge in irony, for it is clear that the lion did not leave its cage, but was burned to death within it. McGrath restored. You doubt my statement, then? Holmes shook his head. No. I believe that you are yourself convinced of what you tell us. But maybe there was another lion, illuminated claws and all. McGrath said. What happened to it then? Holmes smiled in a rather more kindly fashion. No answer as yet to that question, my dear McGrath, but what you have told me might as well be of extreme value. We repaired Greyshot, Holmes and I, to the Royal Caledonian Hotel for lunch, for which we discussed, naturally, the findings of the morning. As we pored over notes that I had made and the copy of Newburger's will, which Greyshot carries everywhere, the head waiter hovered. We enjoyed Ghislaine Bay cod with parsley sauce and pomace de Caledoni, followed by an excellent raisin pudding and custard. We had washed it all down with some drinkable Alsace wine when the head waiter cleared his throat with an insinuating style and asked, "Sir Daikin, the gentleman at the second table on your left, for he is also from London." Holmes smiled and replied, "My dear fellow, in the largest city in the world, where literally millions rub shoulders, I cannot be acquainted with everyone any more than you can with every inhabitant of Aldriki. No, I do not know the gentleman by sight." The waiter bowed apologetically and said, "He is a Mr. Will Goldston." But there, my friend interrupted him. "His name I could not be expected to know, but I observe that he is on the staff of a large store and is possibly in a managerial position." The waiter started and said, "Why, yes, you're right, but how did you know that?" "He is a manager of a department at Gamages of Holborn." Holmes said, "He is quite expensively dressed in clothing of considerable quality, yet their style is that of a decade ago despite their newness. His linen is particularly discreet for that of a man of his years, for he is no more than 30, despite his receding hair. His cufflinks, even his stock pin and watch chain, have been chosen to blend with the background rather than to be displayed." He is dressed down as the professional shop worker needs to in order that his customers may feel superior. I noticed that when he entered, he walked in the style of a shopkeeper, just as you walk in with the style of a waiter. When you bowed to his table, he had nothing but moved his head slightly to one side, the sure sign of a shop worker. The head waiter was still a little dubious. "Yes, but how did you know of his managerial position, Mr. Holmes?" Sherlock smiled and said, "The fact that he is dining at the Royal Caledonian answers your question. Now, Angus, may we have a large pot of your excellent coffee, and would you please present my compliments to Mr. Goldstone, and ask him if he would care to join us." Mr. Goldstone proved indeed to be of about 32 or 33 years old, prematurely bald with remaining wisps upon his brow, which indicated that he had once worn his hair in a quiff. He crossed to our table and gave us a little gesture or mannerism which Holmes had pointed out to the waiter, and he slightly to one side, an unspoken inquiry. He was lean, with a well-defined cheekbone and a hawk-like expression in his heavily lidded eyes. He introduced himself, glancing shrewdly from one to the other. with the air of a man who does not have too much time to spare. We all three shook hands with him, and Holmes bade him sit down and accept a cup of coffee, which he did. We sat and sipped a very hot aromatic liquid, and Holmes took the plunge, saying, "Mr. Goldston, you are, I believe, the manager of a department in the world-famous Holdman store, the Images." He replied, "I am in full charge of that firm conjuring department. In other words, I supply famous magicians with the impedimenta of illusion." He spoke in tones as precise as those of Holmes himself. Indeed, there were several points of similarity between the two men, save that Goldstone spoke with what remained of a dialect. I could not place it, but of course my friend could. Asking, "How long have you been away from your native Liverpool?" Sharply he replied, "About 10 years. I was not aware that it was still there in my speech." Holmes said, "Oh, yes, it is still desirable." Mr. Goldstone, he was losing patience, and said, "Quite so, Mr. Holmes. But what is the business? One does not invite a complete stranger to his table for coffee, having learned something of his background from the head waiter, without having some kind of axe to grind." Goldstone took a watch from his waistcoat pocket and studied it. I tried to lighten the atmosphere by saying, "Be assured that we mean no disrespect and have no wish to waste your time, Mr. Goldstone. My friends and I are greatly concerned over the tragedy at the Empire Theater, and imagined that you might be here in consequence of it too." Goldstone paused before he replied, and Mr. Holmes said nothing, but looked at me, and I knew that which was passing through his mind. Something to the effect that Watson handles these situations so well. It is one of the reasons why I like his company when investigating. At length Goldstone relaxed a little and spoke. "I came here to attend the funeral of Lafayette, who is both a friend and a valued client. However, I was informed that this event had been postponed under an extremely bizarre circumstances. I could hardly believe when I was told that another body had been cremated in mistake for his own." Holmes asked Watson, "When did you last have contact with Newberger, Mr. Goldstone?" Replied, "Personal contact? No, some weeks ago when he was in London, but I received a letter from him some 48 hours ago. Perhaps the last he ever wrote. It concerned his requirements of several yards of teddy bear clothes and a kind of witch that I supplied to him for." Holmes interrupted. What do you think he needed this for?" Wilson said, "I don't think, Mr. Holmes, I know. In his show of employment, a tiny lady to impersonate a teddy bear, a second small person was being trained as a deputy, so obviously the material was used to fashion a duplicate costume." Holmes asked, "Was the quantity ordered consistent with this requirement?" Goldstone became a touch devious. "Well, I mean to say, he may have wanted to make some spares as well. Even I could spot the sudden return of a Merseyside tone to his voice, a raw nerve that had been touched." Sherlock Holmes spoke to Will Goldstone with a reassuring tone. almost as if calming a fertile horse. Come, sir, you can confide in me. I'm merely trying to help Mr. Greyshot here to recover for Newburger's estate that which it is entitled to. I am not acting for the police, and indeed I have no official capacity or responsibility, being actually retired from active work. I have interrupted a fishing holiday to be here. But Goldston was still reticent. It is not a case of my wishing to conceal information. My hesitance was prompted by professional ethics. I deal with a great many professionals who trust in my complete confidentiality. When they order me to supply some items for a consideration, my artisans are likewise trustworthy, though to make doubly sure I give a piece of everything to a different workman, to make usually even in a different district, and giving them only the section of the plans which concern them. Sherlock Holmes whistled softly. I had no idea that the magic of theater required such secrecy, but I applaud your professionalism. But you see, if I were to ask you to reveal to me the mechanics of the scenario of an item for the Lafayette performance, I would not be doing so on behalf of some rival wander worker, nor yet for curiosity. The police are hardly likely to be involved, but of course, were they to be, they would have less regard for the professional ethics than I have myself. The pause which followed was one provided by Goldston, taking a packet of cigarettes from his pocket. He handled the cardboard packet with ease that suggested he did not normally use a case. He offered the pack to each of us in turn. Holmes alone shook his head, and the man from Gamage's lit our cigarettes with a match. Then he inquired, which particular item is it that interests you? Holmes, eager to catch Goldston's relaxed mood, said, "Why not the lion's cage?" "Sir, something of its mechanics would, I feel, be of enormous value, especially to Mr. Greyshot, who, like myself, has no connection with the professional you deal with." Goldston responded, "Very well. I will give you the information you require upon the promise that you have already made." Goldston responded, "Very well. I will give you the information you require upon the promise that you have already made." I do not intend to tire the reader with the details that Mr. Will Goldston gave us. Save those for essential readers to the understanding of this narrative. Indeed, I dare not, for at this time of writing, Goldston is still in business, no longer manager for Image's conjuring department, but as head of his own business, Will Goldston Latitude, with premises in Green Street, just off of Leicester Square. He spent an hour altogether explaining the mechanics of the cage, his words augmented with many a sketch made upon the back of a menu. And also the way of the performance, which was, of course, a paramount importance. The audience see the lion in a small cage at center stage, pacing and roaring in a manner proving the animal to be the real thing. Lafayette enters in his oriental costume and carrying a sword. He is thrust into the cage and is at once attacked by the lion. He falls to the floor of the cage, but to the amazement of everyone in the audience, the lion rears up on its hind legs and removes a false headpiece, revealing itself to be the Great Lafayette. That is the effect, but in fact what happened is this. The real lion, taken mechanically by a combination of spring hinges and an optical principle, to a hidden compartment in the cage. The same mechanism brings Lafayette into view wearing a lion costume. Clever lighting makes the exchange unseen by the audience, especially as their attention is diverted by the entrance of Lafayette, or rather, his double. At the right psychological moment, the double enters the cage, and the rest is obvious, with the real Lafayette removing the lion head. Grisha asked, "Do you mean, sir, that the people do not notice the change from the animal to the man?" Sun said, "No. You see, they have ample time to accustom themselves to the real lion, and then, of course, there is the diversion. We peered the drawings and took in what had been told, but Holmes questioned one aspect of Goldston's narration. The devil must have been more than convincing, and yet I have been told already that no person of actual striking likeness to Lafayette was involved." Goldston replied, "Up to a minute earlier, the real Lafayette had been standing before them in an exactly similar costume. The scenario presented to the audience was that he crossed to the wings to fetch his sword. The double, holding the sword at once, replaced him and stood with his back to the auditorium. In the fastest change ever, Lafayette donned the lion's suit and secretly entered the compartment of the cage, which would so quickly bring him into view. It was slickly done, and always fooled the audience." Holmes nodded, and the authorities into the cremating the wrong body. "Tell me, my dear Goldston, how could the real lion be depended upon to move and snarl? After all, you have yourself suggested that this was necessary to prove its reality. Was it possible to train the creature to thus behave at every performance?" Goldston looked a little sham-faced as he said, "Why, no. Newberger took no chances. He had an electrical device installed under the steel floor of the cage, which gave a series of mild electric shocks to keep Leo lively." As we shook hands with Goldston, Holmes thanked him. "Mr. Goldston, you have given us information which I feel sure will be invaluable in this information and investigation." As the medical expert departed, we retired to the office room, where we sat despite having already taken off our fill of coffee. Grisha said, "I'm sure you meant what you said," to Goldston Holmes, "but I fail to see how what he had to tell us had to do with the diamonds. I have to be quite sure that they are irretrievable before I can tackle the insurance company, other than now having an inkling as to how Newberger affected one of his mysteries. I fail to see how any progress has been made." Holmes said, "Well, exactly. You failed to see at which is right before your eyes. We have solved the riddle of how the lion managed to be in two places at once, for it was clearly Newberger who stopped McGrath trying to escape through a blocked door. The real lion, poor brute, never left its cage in which it was roasted." I said, "I suppose in all that smoke and excitement, McGrath could have made that mistake." Holmes applauded. "Watson, you excel yourself." Grisha asked, "Why then?" Has the body of Newburger in the burnt animal skin not been materialized? Holmes said, "That puzzles me, but perhaps it will yet be discovered." We both missed another very bizarre aspect of McGrath's story, that of the eerie glow from the supposed animal's claws. I suggested some visual effects caused by the reflection of the flames upon the false claws. Holmes chuckled. The glow of fire certainly played its part, but I'll wager the reflection was the light playing upon those diamond rings. He had Greyshot's very fullest attention now, who asked, "You mean the rings must have been still on his hands at that point? Would they glow through the lion's gloves?" Holmes snapped. "Through what the fire had left of them, certainly. If they were still there, they will serve to identify the body if we find it, and satisfy your firm at the same time, Greyshot." The solicitor was animated now. "Do you think the rings will have survived the blaze?" Holmes replied, "Certainly. The stones should, but I am also interested in finding the body so that the funeral can take place. Golston has solved my other questions. As to how the fire started, I'll wager an examination of the lion's cage will confirm my thoughts on that." Greyshot seemed a little ashamed that we should have thought him mindless of these things, and of course, the funeral and the cause of the fire. I did not mean to sound quite so single-minded. Our return to the theater was by way of a gentle stroll, which took so much longer than it should have on account of Holmes' snail's pace of locomotion. I knew my friend well enough to know that his slow pace was not designed to annoy us, rather to give him the chance to mentally digest that which he had learned from Goldston. But being who he was able to keep a quite irritating banter whilst exercising his grey matter. "See the ravens, Watson? You won't see those in London, except within the walls of the tower. I would not even see them there, for the legend of our empire depends on their habitation, rather like the apes of Gibraltar. Ah, there is a member of the clan Anderson in his full tartan and regalia. Did you know that the Scottish clan system was invented by a tailor who owned many bales of varying tartan material?" It went on like a recitation which we endured because we knew that there was a method in every word and deed. He reminded me that at that moment of Shakespeare's schoolboy who, with shining morning face, crept like a snail unwillingly to school. Certainly Greyshot and I were anxious to gain our destination.